question of taxation touches every home in America.
Cutting through the static of the tax world, it's Simply Tax. Brought to you by BKD CPAs and Advisors. Everyone needs a trusted advisor. Who's yours? Now here's your host, Damien Martin.
Hello and welcome to Simply Tax. As you recently heard from the Vice President of Taxation at the AICPA and friend of the podcast Ed Carl in episode 66, we're now more than a year and a half into the new tax law, but there's still a lot of static to cut through on it. I mean, not only are there questions as to whether it's new enough to refer to it as the new tax law anymore, or I guess even what to call it. Is it the TICJA or the TCJA? But static remains in areas where we still need guidance, as well as breaking down what the 2017 tax overhaul meant for taxpayers. Our guest on the podcast today will help us cut through some of that static for manufacturers and manufacturing. Let's get to work.
So I'm Chris Netram. I'm the Vice President of Tax and Domestic Economic Policy at the National Association of Manufacturers, the NAM. The NAM has 14,000 member companies that collectively employ about 13 million men and women who make things in America. Our members are manufacturers in pretty much every industrial sector: tech, heavy industrial, pharma, you name it, they're a member here. And the NAM is their voice in D.C. So we are very much a policy-focused organization. I lead our, like I said, tax and domestic economic policy practice, which is tax and corporate governance and pensions and on and on and on. If it runs through Treasury or the IRS or the SEC, it falls to me. I have colleagues that lead our practices on energy and the environment, on trade, on healthcare, and so forth. We engage in any number of issues, really any issue that's important to a manufacturer, immigration, workforce, all of those things. We've been around 125 years. Next year marks our 125th anniversary. I'm founded in Cincinnati, Ohio, and we continue to go very strong. So that's the NAM in a nutshell.
I know we've talked so much about with the economy and you know how manufacturing kind of at the core of that, and very important perspective that you get, I'm sure, from the members as well in terms of the things that are important to them.
Absolutely. I mean, look, and you hit on a key point there. So manufacturing has what we call the largest multiplier effect of any industrial sector. For every dollar created in manufacturing, more than a dollar is created elsewhere in the economy. It is a huge multiplier effect. And so as manufacturing grows, the larger economy grows as well. That's key, and it manifests itself in several different ways. One is manufacturing is a very connected industry in that there's a huge supply chain throughout each of these industries, in tech and pharma and in defense, right? There are some big players, a lot of smaller players that feed into that, and there's also a large footprint around the globe. So there's a huge global supply chain that feeds into this. So as manufacturing is doing well, you can typically think of your big companies when manufacturing comes to mind. But the story of manufacturing is much broader than that. In fact, there are many, many more small and medium-sized manufacturers than there are large manufacturers. Those can be family-owned businesses. So you see these really great community effects as manufacturing does well, and those small businesses that have stayed local and stayed active in their community do well. I think it's equally important that large companies do well because that has a great impact throughout the world. But the story can often be a hyper-local story.
So I guess looking at kind of the membership group, I mean, in broad strokes, I mean, what's kind of the breakdown of the size of the members and the organizations?
So of our 14,000 members, I think in any given year, about 90 to 94% of our members are small to medium-sized businesses. There's just so many more of them as you would expect.
So kind of hearing that maybe from that group, well, just membership at large, right? I mean, we just had the largest, tax overhaul in 30 plus years. Obviously, there were a lot of things that really have, I guess, impacted, manufacturers, obviously. So, now that we're 18 months or so, a little more than that in, how have manufacturers responded to tax reform?
It's been overwhelmingly positive for manufacturers. Now, look, every company is different. Right? Some companies are better off, some companies are not. But overall, from an industry perspective, it's been overwhelmingly positive. We do a quarterly survey for our companies, and we've done it every quarter for the past 21 years. One of the things we measure is optimism inside the manufacturing sector. That is, do you see business getting better for your company, for your manufacturing company over the next 12 months? Historically, average is about 75% over the last 21 years. Pretty optimistic.
Yeah.
Post-tax reform, we hit the highest rate of optimism ever, and it's remained at historic highs since tax reform. When you ask our members about it, it is because of tax reform. Tax reform coupled with regulatory reform, those two really remove impediments to growing a business in the U.S. and makes it more attractive, actually, to invest in the U.S. So we asked our members after tax reform, what does that mean for you? What do you plan to do in 2018 as a result of tax reform? 86% of our members said that they would invest in new equipment and new facilities. 77% said that they would hire more workers. 72% said that they would increase wages. That's what they said at the beginning of 2018.
Okay.
For the things that we've tracked, one of the key stats that we saw at the end of 2018, what happened? That's what we said that would happen. Yeah. That's what they said they would do. What actually happened? What actually happened is there was 284,000 jobs created in the manufacturing sector, the most in the last 2 decades.
Yeah.
It has been overwhelmingly positive, and it's gone up and down the supply chain. Big companies, small companies, all of them seem to be growing. Not to discount some of the challenges that they face in other areas, particularly in the trade space. I mean, that those create some headwinds. But tax reform has really set the stage for the U.S. to be competitive. And when I say that, I mean, think of where we were. Well, I'm going to focus specifically on the corporate rate here.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of our members are pass-through businesses that don't pay tax to the corporate rate. But it's just an example. The corporate rate that we had before was 35%, the highest among developed countries, the highest in the OECD. We moved that rate to 21%, which puts it as just average. It doesn't make us, the lowest rate in the developed world. It makes us really middle of the pack.
Yeah.
And moving to just the middle of the pack, we created 284,000 jobs. That is a tremendous success story for manufacturing.
Yeah, absolutely it is. So is the tax rate, you think, one of the primary drivers, or maybe some other levers? I mean, it's multifaceted because there's a lot in there, obviously. Right. But yeah, maybe some of the other aspects that maybe are contributing to that result?
Sure. I mean, look, the rate is a big driver there, but there are many others. I mean, so we had 5 key priorities heading into tax reform. And these weren't priorities that we came up with in August of 2017 as the process we're hitting up. These are the 5 things we said we wanted for decades now. We said to Congress, look, if you give us a lower corporate rate, if you reduce the tax burden on pass-through businesses, if you give us incentives to invest in capital equipment, if you retain the R&D tax credit, if you move towards a territorial tax system on the international side, if you give us those things, you're going to see manufacturing in the U.S. take off. And in large part, Congress did those things. Yeah. And we're delivering. And so from our perspective, it's now incumbent on us to show to Congress that we're keeping our promise. It's a credibility issue, and it's also an accountability issue. If we come to you and say, if you give us these 5 things, we're going to create more jobs, increase wages, invest in America, well, you need to hold us accountable for that. And the only way you can do that is if we're actually publicly telling you what's happening out there. So one of the things I wanted to mention is this campaign that we started immediately after tax reform called Keeping Our Promise. So in that campaign, we focus on an individual company and highlight its response to tax reform. And we go hyper-local with this because, as you've seen, the kind of broader national narrative around tax reform can become politicized. We are not a political organization. In fact, we're post-partisan. We work with anyone on either side of the aisle. As long as they want to do something that supports manufacturing, we're happy to have a conversation with you, and we appreciate the support. Yeah. So we want to take this out of the partisan lane and focus on individual companies and what they're doing. And the stories that we've heard from our member companies, the stories that we're sharing and telling publicly are really amazing. Many of them are doing the things that we said they would do, right? All of them are doing the things that we said they would do. Hiring more workers, expanding their facilities, buying new equipment, raising wages, increasing benefits. Pretty much everyone is doing that. But the stories that really get me are the ones that are doing more than that. There's a company in Denver, Colorado, Centennial Bolt. Their story just sticks with me. They're a small family-owned business based in Denver. Thanks to tax reform, they've been able to do a bunch of things. I think they invested in more equipment. I think they opened a second facility. I believe they brought some manufacturing back from China. All of that, really great stuff. But what sticks with me is that because of tax reform, solely because of tax reform, they were able to fund the construction of a shelter for homeless women in Denver, Colorado. There is now 150 beds for homeless women in Denver, Colorado that didn't exist prior to tax reform, thanks solely to tax reform. And we're seeing stories like that play out in communities across the country. And that, I think, is really important to tell and share, because tax is ultimately not about rates. Rates are important from a business perspective, right? All that is. But tax, much like anything else that comes out of the legislative process, is ultimately about people. The story is not around rates. The story is around the impact on working families. What are we doing to help our communities? Are we providing more opportunities to people in the U.S.? The answer to that is yes. Tax reform has enabled us to do that. And that's the story we need to be telling.
Like you said, it gets a little mixed sometimes with some of the politics and the other aspects of it. Much has been written, obviously, about this new tax law and kind of what its effects have been. But there are sometimes some conflicting headlines or stories that come from it. So are you kind of hearing that in the member group? Because it sounds like obviously everybody's very positive on it, but what would you say in response to some of those that are maybe pointing out some of the things that didn't go quite as well after tax reform?
I think a big part of that is the politics around tax reform. What everyone can agree on is that the U.S. tax code was uncompetitive. You go back, wind the clock back to pre-tax reform, there is not a single person that said the U.S. tax code is working exactly as it should be, that it's making us more competitive. What we saw prior to tax reform were corporate inversions. We saw people leaving the country. We saw high rates that were disincentivizing investments in family-owned businesses. Post-tax reform, it's easy to knock the bill because you have something tangible in front of you to say, hey, this wasn't great. But I think you need to look at how far we've come since tax reform. What have we not seen? I haven't seen any headlines about corporate inversions. I literally have not seen one since tax reform.
Right.
Maybe it's out there and I missed it, but I've not seen one. And that seemed to be almost a daily occurrence pre-tax reform.
And so I guess maybe one of the other aspects of this new tax law is it was a very quick windup. As you mentioned, what you've been doing behind the scenes and the messaging and the points have been around for, it's been a big windup there.
Right.
Years, decades. But, in terms of the actual process from September to December and enactment, it was very fast. We needed a lot of guidance. We've gotten some. We're still missing some. So I don't know, what are you seeing and hearing on guidance and kind of what are some areas that NAM is looking for to maybe get some guidance?
Look, guidance is critical, right? This has been a fundamental rewrite of the tax laws, creating new provisions that had never existed before. How do those interact with current law? How should they be interpreted? What do practitioners, what positions can they take on tax returns? Those are all critical questions. And Treasury has been working through that. We've been into Treasury multiple times to talk to them about the issues that are important to manufacturers. The guidance process is chugging along. We expect guidance to continue to come out for the foreseeable future, because this is just a massively complicated law.
There's a lot there. I know one in particular, the business interest expense limitation, and maybe some surprises that were in the proposed regulations. We're still waiting on the final regulations. Is that something that you guys are advocating for, I guess?
Hugely important to manufacturers. So the surprise that you're alluding to, I'm assuming, is the interaction of 163J and 263 Cap A.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Exactly. And that is an issue we identified almost immediately after the regs came out, and have engaged with Treasury, harnessed all of our forces, multiple meetings on Capitol Hill, lots of meetings on Treasury. We had 84 other associations join us in a letter to Treasury pointing out the flaws in there. And I feel like we've done the work that we need to do to get a favorable result. Ultimately, it's Treasury's decision. We've made strong arguments. That's what we can do. And I hope that they ultimately make the right call at the end of the day.
Are you hearing anything in terms of timing at this point? It's always hard to say. Nobody has a crystal ball, obviously, but I know there was some talk initially of maybe trying to hit the 18-month mark, which would have been in June, and that clearly didn't happen. So, yeah, any word from your perspective, what you're hearing on timing?
On 163J, it could be as soon as late summer, but probably in the early fall.
Okay.
That's what I'm hearing.
So I guess what's your take on the businesses that are looking at, they're maybe on extension, and what they should do if they were maybe hopeful that get some additional guidance?
I think it's incumbent on everyone to talk to Treasury. Talk to your representative. This country only works well, a representative democracy or republic only works well to the extent that citizens are engaged. And making that point that, some lawmakers may not appreciate that timing is important here, that's critical to do. From the Treasury Department perspective, I think that there is perhaps something short of official guidance that they can do to help provide some clarity as they work towards finalization. It's important for them to hear that there is a need to do that.
Are there other areas? I mean, obviously that's one that's received a lot of attention because I think it caught me off guard, I think, and surprised a lot of people. And it was a little bit of I don't know that everybody realized it right away that it was that it was in there, Yeah. But are there other areas, guidance related or otherwise, that you're kind of hoping to see more on?
A lot in the international space. Guilty remains an issue for our members that operate abroad. That's a particularly difficult issue because that deals with the interaction of the new provision, the new guilty provision, and the existing expense allocation rules. So how do those two interact, and what is the position Treasury is going to take there? I think there's work to be done there. We spent a lot of time working with Treasury on that. I know, and a lot of our members individually have done that as well. I continue to hope that Treasury looks to provide as much relief as possible, and we're going to continue to be at the table on that one.
It's August, and summer vacations are almost over. But sharpen your pencils and get your tax mind ready for what's to come this fall with Simply Tax. Starting August 12th, we're kicking off our Back to Tax Reform series on the podcast, where you'll hear industry-specific insights from tax practitioners on applying the TICSA during the first filing season, and also get planning points for the upcoming fall season and year-end. So great, so we can kind of just geek out on tax reform here. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out. So you mentioned that the outlook has been very positive. The survey results very positive. The reaction's been very positive. Kind of looking forward, what are you seeing, hearing, expecting to see from a tax policy perspective in the economy?
So from a short-term perspective, I think the two things that are most critical to get done are technical corrections and tax extenders. Mm-hmm. That becomes a vehicle issue, right? I don't think either of those items move on their own as standalone bills in the House or the Senate. I think they need a larger must-pass vehicle, such as a debt limit bill, a government funding bill, something like that, to attach themselves to in order to move. But there's work to be done on both of those. I think each chamber is in a different position on both of those. Mm-hmm. The technical corrections are politicized right now, and to a lesser extent, extenders are politicized as well in the House in particular. So there is absolutely work to be done there. But the business community writ large has been making the case that certainty is important. Correcting mistakes is important. The tax code should work as intended. We've been making that case. Lawmakers are hearing us, and I remain hopeful that something gets done there in the short term. Yeah, but we'll see.
I'm hopeful as well, because it would be nice to. That's certainly something that we is on the tax side need. That the uncertainty is not a good thing.
Absolutely.
And I would imagine that probably even holds back on some of those. On the promises of taking the action on some of the provisions and what they were intended to do. If you don't really know how they're going to work, how are you going to take action on them?
Exactly. I mean, especially for our smallest businesses, mm-hmm. right? For our small members that are more cash dependent, cash flow basis operations, you need certainty in order to plan your future. Our largest members that have access to financing through the capital markets little different position. They need certainty for sure, but it's really mission critical for our smallest guys to get certainty there.
Well, I guess maybe speaking of uncertainty, when you kind of look forward, obviously we're heading into an election year next year, and tax law is only as permanent as until the next one, I guess you could say maybe. And there are obviously aspects of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that expired, especially on the individual side. Seeing much on that side, what are you expecting to see as we get in the next couple of years here?
Well, look, I mean, you've seen the debates, right, where pretty much every serious Democratic candidate has said they would repeal the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in whole or in part. Some say they would do that on day one. I don't think that that's possible, but regardless, there is not a lot of love for the TCJA among that crop of candidates. If that happens, we've asked our members, right? What does that mean if tax reform goes away? Not tax reform at large, but kind of the key business provisions of tax reform. If that goes away, what does that mean for you? For manufacturers, and here any answer greater than zero is a very bad answer for the United States.
Yeah.
About 2/3 would have to reduce their investments in the U.S. More than half would look to reduce U.S. employment and scale back on U.S. wages. That's really not a great answer for the United States. Think about where we are. We are at merely average right now.
Uh-huh.
Scaling back the TCJ puts us back into an uncompetitive position. And that's a case that needs to be made. That's a case that we are making, but more voices need to be making that case as well.
What are ways that members or manufacturers or taxpayers can, I guess, get that word out?
Look, I think there's a couple of ways, right? One, for manufacturers, for the businesses themselves, if you're part of a trade association, talk to your trade association. Mm-hmm. Make sure that this is front of mind for them. And for many of the large business associations, I know that it is front of mind for them. If you are an individual, if you are a manufacturing worker, the fact that we could see a reduction in manufacturing employment if tax reform goes away, that should worry you. The fact that wages could be reduced if tax reform goes away, that should worry you as well. If you're an individual, I would say reach out to your congressman. That's what democracy is all about. I think the opponents of tax reform have been given kind of free rein to deride it as a giveaway to the wealthy and large corporations. That's a misnomer, at least for manufacturers. That's not what tax reform is. Tax reform represents the ability to invest in U.S. workers. And that's, for us, that's what it means. And that message has to get out there. And that comes best from inside the Beltway groups, but so much more effective to have real people tell their congressman and their senator that story as well.
So we've kind of covered a lot of ground here, but are there things we haven't talked about so far that are maybe other policies, other areas that NAM is looking at and hoping to see some action on?
Absolutely. Look, one of the most critical issues facing manufacturers across the country is workforce. Mm-hmm. Finding a skilled workforce is incredibly difficult. If things don't change, we've done some economic models, and I think we'll have about a shortage of 2.5 million unfilled jobs over the next decade if things don't change. There will be open manufacturing jobs, not people with the right skills to fill those jobs. 2.5 million of those. That's a tremendous missed opportunity for manufacturing in the U.S.
Certainly.
We're doing a lot there to address that. In fact, we have an entire nonprofit partner that focuses solely on that, the Manufacturing Institute, that's working on some innovative things, working on apprenticeships, working on new programs to help people transition out of the military and right into manufacturing jobs. That's a place where a lot of work needs to be done. I think immigration is also another place where work needs to be done. Sure, there's a business community element to that, right? That can be a workforce issue. It's also an issue of conscience, right? Mm-hmm. What's going on at the border right now, difficult when you're facing it. It is a difficult thing to see, and that's something that we need to address as soon as possible in a bipartisan manner.
You talk about the workforce. Are there in maybe just the need for changing and upskilling? I know that's something that gets talked about a lot, and innovation and so forth. Does that enter into the equation, the policies at all from your perspective?
Absolutely. So it's upskilling, that's a big part of it. It's also perception, right? So there is a perception, particularly among parents who are dissuading their children from going into manufacturing. There's a perception that when you say the word manufacturing, you're thinking of manufacturing from the 1800s or the 1920s, dirty, dark, and dangerous. Those are the words we keep hearing. there's a perception challenge there. We do a thing called Manufacturing Day. Any day can be Manufacturing Day, but we pick a day in October, and we have our members open their doors to high school students and their parents. I think last year we did about 3,500 events around the country on Manufacturing Day. And really, that's a perception issue. We want people to come in and see that manufacturing isn't the 1920s. Manufacturing is Tony Stark and Iron Man. That's what it is. It's high tech. It's pretty cool. That's one of the key challenges we have right now.
Just getting the awareness and the education. Absolutely.
That's right.
Other things that maybe we haven't talked about that you'd add in?
Well, I'll tell you this, give a plug for the NAM.
Sure.
So next year is our 125th anniversary. We're going to be celebrating it. And the way we're celebrating it, we're using it as an opportunity to work on some of those perception issues. We want to use that as a way to highlight what manufacturing is, use it as a way to change the perception, and really use it as a way to increase the manufacturing workforce in the U.S. So you'll see us doing a lot of events around the country over the next year that will really be manufacturing workforce focused in conjunction with our 125th anniversary. So stay tuned. Those will be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd imagine that's excellent. Quite a landmark to reach, right?
Absolutely. I hope I live to 125.
Right? Yeah. Well, this is great. I think we've kind of covered everything that I had in mind. Anything else on your mind that you add, or maybe some closing thoughts, even just bringing the conversation full circle?
So I'll tell you this. One, thank you for having me. That's the first thing I'm going to say.
My pleasure.
BKD is a tremendous partner of the NAM, and we really appreciate your partnership. The firm is filled with so many talented professionals whose advice we really value. I mean, what you hear from your clients, the concerns that you're able to filter back to us, very, very helpful. I mean, that helps us. We factor that into our calculus when we're thinking about what can help manufacturing writ large in the U.S. The last thing I would say, and I know I've hit this point a few times, but I can't stress it enough: participate in our democracy. I mean, if you want the system to work and you want it to work well, the founding fathers meant for people to participate. You got to do that, otherwise it collapses in on itself. Well, great stuff. Well, thank you again. Great. I enjoyed the conversation, and thank you for all the great work that the NAM is doing. Especially, obviously I'm a bit of a tax nerd over here, so I enjoy some of the policy work that you're doing. So thank you very much. Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it. That's it for today. If you haven't already, please leave us a rating and review out on Apple Podcasts. We use this feedback and your emails to simplytax@bkd.com to make the podcast better for everyone. And they go a long way in helping others to find Simply Tax. Show notes of this episode, which include more information about our guest today, are available at bkd.com/simplytax. I'm Damien Martin, and thank you for listening. The information contained in this episode of Simply Tax is based on data available as of the date of its release. BKD is under no obligation to update this information if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances. Any information provided is not to be considered as tax, legal, or financial advice. Please consult your tax advisor before acting on any matters covered.